Most people don't have too much trouble with one-step algebra equations, as long as those equations have whole numbers in them. But sometimes people get all upset just because we've got a fraction in it. Don't let fractions scare you. We solve these just like any other equation. Why is the x not by itself? The x is not by itself because it's being added by 2 3/5. How do we undo adding? What's the inverse operation? It is subtracting. Now, remember that it doesn't matter how we saw this equation. If it were written like this, 3 1/4 equals x plus 2 3/5, we wouldn't subtract 3 1/4 from both sides just because it's over here. We would still say, why is the x not by itself? It's not by itself because you're adding 2 3/5 to it. So what we're going to do, we are going to subtract 2 3/5 from both sides, okay? Now, one of the things that I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and change these to improper fractions when I do this. So I'm going to put x plus 13/5, and I'm going to leave a little space here, equals 13/4. Okay, the reason I left a little space is now I can go and subtract from both sides. Minus 13/5, minus 13/5. Okay, now these will go away. The next thing I'm going to do, if you've left enough space, you can do it right here on this line. But since you're taking notes probably, I'm going to do it on another line. X equals 13/4 times 5/5. I'm getting a common denominator. Minus 13/5 times 4/4. Now don't be alarmed that I did these horizontally. I'll show you in a minute how it's the same thing if you did it vertically like you usually do with whole numbers. Okay, x equals 13 times 5. Go over on the side and do that. And you'll get 65/20 minus 13 times 4. You'll get 52/20. And then you're going to come up with, if you need to, you may go over on the side. This you can probably do in your head, but if you make mistakes doing it in your head, certainly go to the side. X equals 13/20. Okay, so that's my answer. Now, whenever we do one of these, we want to check it. All right, so I'm going to check it. And the way I check is to start by writing down the original equation, x plus 2 3/5 equals 3 1/4. Now I substitute in 13/20 plus, let me go ahead and write this as an improper fraction, 13/5 equals 3 1/4. Okay, folks, a lot of people just say, okay, 3 1/4 equals 3 1/4, but you haven't worked it out. You don't know if that's right or not, so you actually have to do that. So you need a common denominator. I left enough space so I can do it right here. Now I have 13/20 plus 13 times 4 is 52/20 equals, now I'm going to go ahead and change this to an improper fraction. I could either simplify this or I could get an improper fraction on both sides that's the same. So this is, actually I'll just leave it like that. I'll leave it as 3 1/4, but you could make it an improper fraction. So I'm going to get 65/20 equals 3 1/4. Now, I would have to go over on the side and figure out my fraction. 65/20, that's 65 divided by 20. It gives me 3. 60 with 5 left over. That's 3 and 5/20 equals 3 and 1/4. And if we got a common denominator on that, you'd have 3. If you reduce that, you'd have 3 and 1/4 equals 3 and 1/4. Okay, so that works just fine. Now, let me show you another way you could have written this. You could have written this as, when we started with this problem, x plus 2 and 3/5 equals 3 and 1/4. You could have subtracted like this right here, 2 and 3/5 minus 2 and 3/5. You'll find as you get into bigger algebra problems with more steps in them, that especially for fractions, it usually works best to write it this way. This would work. Now, the other thing you might notice over here is that you would be able to do this one by subtracting the fraction parts and the whole number parts separately. Now, I don't start writing extra equal signs in here, so I'm not going to start doing this equals, I wouldn't do the 5/5 and put another equal sign like that. So I'm going to go over on the side and do it, because I don't want 2 equal signs in an algebra equation, because when you're doing operations to both sides, if you have 2 equal signs, then you've got 3 sides, not just 2. So I'm going to go over on the side and do that part. So I'm going to do 3 and 1/4 minus 2 and 3/5. And I'll subtract these parts separately, get a common denominator, 5/5, 4/4. And then I get this equals 5/20, and this is 12/20, but I'm subtracting. So I can't take 12 from 5. I don't just say 12 minus 5, it's 5 minus 12. So I have to borrow from here. And this is 1 and 5/20. So that equals, I'm running out of space a little bit, but we'll fit it in there, 25/20 minus 12/20. And so that gives me 13/20. Now I've borrowed over here, so this becomes 0. My answer is x equals 13/20. Now notice that I wrote this whole step out here. It's okay to do minus 2 and 3/5 here without having the whole equation, but then when you get to the next step, make sure you write the whole thing out. Here, it's just my answer. When we were here, it was not just my answer. You wouldn't want to just put this and leave the x out. You want to write the whole equation. X equals all of that. X equals this. And then here. So now you see how to do problems like this.